Welcome to our weekly book club episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. I'm your host, Amanda, and my lovely co-host is...
Hello, I'm Meagan.
So this is our book club episode, but don't panic. You don't need to read the book to be here. Some of our listeners read along with us, but plenty just tune in for our kind of digest version of the book. Either way, we don't judge and we're just happy you're here.
Absolutely. We are currently reading Differently Wired by Deborah Reber and loving it. One of the awesome things about this book is that it really lines up well with our core values. So we are loud and proud supporters of DEI here at Homeschool Moms Unfiltered, and this book really speaks so eloquently to a kinder world where the needs of neurodivergent individuals are considered and met.
Yes, that it definitely does. And if you're new to the podcast, we don't stop at DEI. We believe that trans rights and women's rights are human rights. We believe common sense gun laws are way overdue, and vaccines save lives. So if you're trying to find your people, especially your homeschooling people, but keep running into those flat earthers and the people who honestly think humans rode dinosaurs into their cave homes, we feel your frustration, okay? You can relax and settle in here.
Yeah, there's none of that here. Let's dive in. We're up to the second half of this book, and these are called tilts in this half. Debbie introduced us to these at the end of part one, and basically her concept of tilts are these small shifts that we can make to our mindset, our parenting approach, etc., to grow as parents of neurodivergent kiddos. So tilt one is called Question Everything You Thought You Knew About Parenting. So let's dive in.
I think this is a good one, right? Because if you do nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this book, remembering to question everything you thought you knew, you thought you needed to do, will make the biggest change in a happy family life, better parenting, just better all of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I loved these. These were great. So I have the first note, which is on page 84, the very first page of Tilt 1. And there's just a line here that says, it's a quote from an author named Neil Donald Walsh. And he says, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. And I love that. In my last two houses that I lived in, I had this blackboard thing behind me in my office space, and mainly so that my students would see it when I teach online. And it said, I forget the exact wording, but it was something like, nothing great comes from comfort zones or something like that. And I know how you feel about absolutes, Amanda, when you say like nothing great can come from it, right? It was just kind of a really succinct way for me to muster my courage sometimes when I was about to do something really, really big that was scary. I mean, you and I both travel solo a lot with our kids and things like that, our respective kids. And there were times when I was setting out on adventures and things like that where it was scary as hell, and I would have these ridiculous kind of visualizations in my head of all the things that could go wrong and stuff like that. And so that was always kind of like my putting on my big girl panties quote was like, nothing amazing. Like, you do not live a great life in your comfort zone. You don't live a bold, adventurous, memorable life in your comfort zone. So I loved the fact that that was there. I liked it. And then I see we both noted question everything. Do you want to tackle that first?
Well, yeah, so I just like the fact, so she says question everything. That's the whole point of this. But then she breaks it down into some areas that I think, like to help people really, because it's one thing to be like, oh, question everything. And you're like, yeah, okay, I do. But to have someone actually say like, okay, education, literally everything from how important is preschool to lunch boxes. Do you need the kind of lunchbox you think you need? School lunches. Do they need to eat school lunch? Do you need to pack school lunch? Attending in-person school, right? You're listening to a homeschool podcast, at least if you listen to our other episodes. So have you really thought about that and why that matters to you, or why you think maybe they need to go back in high school, or maybe they need to this or that? The value of homework. So many parents are like, well, we just do homework because the teacher sends it. Well, is there value to it? Are you just doing it because you've been told to and so you're rolling with it? Like, are you like question everything? Okay, then the next one is parenting styles. And this is one of those things, right? A lot of us have thought about it, but not everyone has. Is it what you want, or is it what your parents did? And even if it is what you want, is it working? Because just because you read a book about it and you thought this is totally how I'm going to parent doesn't mean that that way works with the kids or the family or the situation that you're in.
Or across all of
nutrition.
your
Oh,
kids, right? Different kids need different
yeah.
things.
No, absolutely. That's so true. Then the next one was nutrition. And like it's summed up best by like the last line in this. She's like, just be flexible with your ideals. I don't think anyone is going to completely throw their ideals and, best case scenario around nutrition out the window. But you do have to be flexible based on a lot of things outside of your control. And we've talked about that before in the regular podcast. So tune in if you want more on that. She says, your child's social life. We talked about this a little bit in just a recent episode, but that thing is it what you want? Is it what you think your kid needs as far as social life goes? Or is it what they actually want? Like,
Mhm.
pay attention. And then the last one that she lists specifically here is personal characteristics and traits. And she's specifically pointing out like introverts versus extroverts. And there has become this narrative that one is better than the other. Is it actually better? Like the world goes round because you have a mix of these personalities. And most companies know that, right? Like most companies look to build teams that are made up of a mix of personalities. So why do we prize one over the other? And really just thinking about those kinds of things. And so I liked the way that she broke that down and kind of dove into it at the very beginning.
All right. Then my next note is on page 87, which on the previous page for me, it's a new section called When We Don't Question, We Stay Stuck, which sounds unpleasant. So there's a quote here that says, unless and until we honestly examine how we think and feel about every aspect of raising our differently wired kids, we'll be subconsciously seeing everything through the default lens of the old, outdated paradigm. And there's some stuff in here where she mentions, again, thinking outside the box. It's a phrase that comes up a couple of times in here. And I'm not sure if you picked up on it, Amanda, because last week we talked about the fact that I despise that phrase and you were like, I'm okay with that. So I jumped in like, oh, every time it came up in the reading. And it's kind of that same thing. Even when you're comparing everything to the thing that you're still looking at it through the lens of that thing. So I'm all about breaking it down as down to like a cellular level and then rebuilding things, because the thing that will always kind of seep in and influence the thing that you're trying to view from a fresh perspective. It's kind of like we talked when we were doing something about college essays like ages ago. You talked about proofreading and how when you proofread something, you read it as what it is intended to say because you wrote it and you know what it's meant to say. And so
Mhm.
you miss things. And so I think it's kind of that same thing. It's like when you're looking at it and you're trying to have a fresh perspective, but it's so clouded by the thing that it's so really breaking it so far down so that to the best of your ability that's not happening. It's going to be really hard not to have that happen. But that was kind of my
Yeah.
thought from that section there.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And yeah, fundamentally, you're always going to see things through the lens of what you know. But if you're open to other people and other opinions and ideas and ways of being, when you filter, it definitely helps for sure.
Is that-
Just in the next paragraph after that, she makes a point to say, as our kids get older, we'll continue to face doubts from ourselves and others about the way things need, quote unquote, to look versus the way things actually are. And I just thought that was a good point because there are a couple other times a little later in the reading, and there was some stuff earlier in the reading where a lot of it I felt like that really applies more when my kiddo was younger. But I do think it's important to remember that as your kids get older, you put away a lot of things, but a lot of new things come up, right? We're going to get to this. It's essentially the next one. But as your kids get older, there's a lot of should, like, oh, well, they should have the experience of this, or they need to be able to do that. And I feel like we do that a lot more with teenagers. They should have prom. They should have their driver's permit. They should be able to clean their room without me reminding them. They should be able to turn in homework without me being on top of them about it. I, you know, think about it. Does it need to be that way? Or, can you work within the reality of the situation? And so then, yeah, I totally spoiler alerted myself. But on page 88, the next section is get out of limited thinking. And in that, she really brings up this idea of using words like should, needs to, or has to is like really good indication that you're actually using this like limited system of thinking and you're operating from a really rigid belief system. So even if
Hmm.
you don't think you are, if you find that you're positioning something as like, well, they should, or he really needs to, like, that's an excellent, like, in our house, anytime someone says always or never, it's like, hold up. Is it really always or never? Like, that's a very absolute system. So let's backtrack and really think about what we want to say there. I would argue that maybe in your house, there should also be, as soon as someone utters should or needs to, like, is it really? Like,
Yeah.
are we putting someone else's expectations or other expectations that we don't really have onto our family that we don't need to?
I love that. Yeah. And then she's got, along with the shoulds, there's something just below what you were talking about that says, plainly put, words like those don't jibe with the business of raising differently wired kids. And I just made a note that I feel like that actually just applies to life in general, probably more so to differently wired kids, but everybody is a unique individual. And so that should and that those expectations, they might not apply to a different person. So even if maybe you have one differently wired kid, but then neurotypical kids in the mix or something like that, kind of feel like that's just a great general statement, is to question why we're doing things. Are we doing it this way because we've always done it this way? Is there a better way to do it? Is there something that fits this child better, that fits the situation better? So I think it's even broader than she gives it credit for in the book.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Then on 89, one of the shoulds was, one of the examples that she gives of a should is that kiddo needs a bigger circle of friends. And I think we see this very, very often in homeschool groups. You know, my kid doesn't have any friends, this, that, the other thing. And a lot of times somebody will chime in. There'll be a lot of comments saying, have you tried, scouts? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? Have you Dungeons and
Co-ops.
Dragons?
Boom.
Right. And then there's usually one person that kind of like sheepishly raises their hands and goes, does your kid want more friends? Like,
Mhm.
do they ask about this? Is this something that you've talked to them about? Is this something that is their desire as well? Or is it your desire for them? Because sometimes there are kids that are very content with one or two close friends or small circle of friends or online friends versus in real life friends. And so we, before we go out there and kind of first worry ourselves into a tizzy, number one, and then number two, put all this effort into something that might not even really be important to them. So that one really stood out to me because we see that conversation so often.
Yeah, no, for sure. I totally agree with that.
Then in the same section here, she's got a section here called Imagine What Could Be. And so it's kind of building this ideal scenario. And so she says here on 91, she has a section here, thinking outside the box. There's my phrase. Thinking outside the box like Jill and imagining what could be requires intention. It means consciously setting aside time to explore what an ideal day or life in a perfect world would look like for your child. And I just love that. There is so much intentionality behind this setup. On the next page, where she's got a section called Fill Your Inspiration Bucket, it says, even when things may not be going well to begin with, shaking things up can be a scary prospect. And it is. I totally get that. But if your kiddo is, if you're at this point, your kiddo is probably not doing amazing. Something's not working. Something's out of sync. Something isn't in alignment for them. And so you really don't have a ton to lose most of the time. That's kind of my thing, is like, how much worse could it be? Right. And so that's one of those things too that kind of gets me over a hurdle of trying something new.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think the point in that is even if the answer is how much worse could it be, and you're like, it could be a lot worse, right? Like, you know, sometimes there are moments in life that are ripe for, let's try something different and see if we get to that next level. Like, this is the perfect time for us to try something new and see if it really levels up our family life in one way or another. And, so just being aware of that and trying hard to not let the fear and the concern of like, well, it could actually get a lot worse. Like, yeah, but like maybe this is the perfect time to level up. Like, give it a try.
Well, so it could get a lot worse, but it could get a lot better. But also a lot of times if it does get a lot worse, you could always, most of the time, you could retreat. So if you try something new and it's a disaster, it's like retreat, retreat. I mean, we had that when we started homeschooling was my kids were in this amazing biliterate program that was lottery to get in. And so I had no choice. If homeschooling didn't work, they weren't getting their spaces back in the bilit program. And so that was one of my big concerns when I pulled my kids was I crossed my fingers and toes and sat on the edge of my seat for ages waiting for these lottery results to see if they got the space. And if I pull them and we regret it, they're not going to have these spaces anymore. And so, and all their friends would still be in that program too, because the BiLit program, every year, some kids would opt out and new kids would come in, but generally it was this core group that moved. So it was like, so sometimes you can't go back, but a lot of times if you make a change and you pivot and it's a real disaster, a lot of times you can go back at least to your old status quo, which wasn't great, but maybe it was better than the new one.
Yeah, I mean, there's something we had a similar thing, right? We were in an in-person charter school that was virtual at the time, but we were kind of holding on to that spot thinking, what if we want him to be able to go back in person? And the charter school we were at, they had over 500 applications for 25 seats. Like we didn't get in the first year that we applied, and we did get in the second year. And so we were kind of like really hesitant to let that go.
Mhm.
But again, it was that and in fairness, we talked about it before in the show. We didn't. The first couple of years, we held on to that and really muddled through a bad situation until we kind of hit that breaking point of like, this isn't sustainable. So we've got to do something. What's that something going to be? And hopefully you make those changes before you hit your breaking point. But I think the vast majority of us wait until we hit our breaking point. And it's like, okay, it's not sustainable. What are we going to do now? So yeah, I mean, it just kind of is what it is. But we're almost at the end of this till. These are pretty quick ones if you're following along.
So I had tossed my notes in a little earlier in the day than you had, and I'm amazed at how our notes line up this week. A lot of times we're like all over the place, and we were in sync today.
Yeah.
All right. So then the next thing is still in the same tilt. She's talking about doing an activity. And one of the things that Deborah Reber pointed out at the end of section 1 was that these tilts are not meant to give you a ton of extra work. They're meant to be fairly small exercises, easy to implement exercises. So she's got an activity here on page 93 called Do an Ideal Day Exercise. And the purpose is to explore what could be by closing your eyes and visualizing your way through an ideal day in the life of both you and your child, from first waking up through bedtime. The more detailed, the better. Then explore ways to bring even one piece of that vision into your current reality. So I like the fact because she did stress to us that this would not be something that would be more work on an already overwhelmed parent. It was like, okay, take the time to visualize it and just take one piece of it. Take one piece because too, if you change too many things at one time, it's hard to figure out what's working, what's not working. Sometimes we get really excited about a new idea and we change a whole bunch of stuff and then our kids have whiplash because they weren't involved in all of the thinking that led up to that. Do you ever do that like with your spouse or something, Amanda, where you have like this whole conversation in your head and you bring them in on like step 14 and then you're annoyed that they can't keep up and you're like, what do you mean you don't understand my plan? And so you've kind of had that with your kids here too, where you've thought out like this ideal day and this new vision and you change all this stuff and your kids are like, whoa, this is completely different than what we've been doing. What's happening here? So just change that one piece. And if it works, maybe pull another one in. Maybe pull another one in, but making these slow transitions and these slow shifts.
Yeah, no, for sure. So then this tilt 1 wraps up with she does these start now boxes at the very end of each tilt. And so this one says, make a list of the things you want to question in relation to your child's life and start getting curious today. And again, it's one of those things. It's not a huge thing, but it's a very fundamental thing. And I do feel like this is probably going to take a while, right? You're going to have to unpack some things. You're going to have to think about things. If you really want to be successful at this, you're going to have to listen to some other people to make sure that you're not only seeing it through your own perspective of like, oh, well, this is what I know. And so I'm thinking about all the other ways I could do it. Well, surely you're going to miss ideas and things if you're only thinking about what you know. So I do disagree a little on the fact that this isn't going to take a lot of time and effort on someone who's already a bit overwhelmed. But I do think it's hugely important for like a successful parenting journey and a happy home in general. Like, I just think this is really important.
Mhm. I think it's a good first tilt for that reason too,
Yeah.
where she talked about the fact that they made sense to her sequentially, the way she ordered them in the book, but you can do them in any order you want. But it really does seem like a good first one.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I agree because I think if you do nothing else with this book, do tilt one. I'm sure that tilts 2 through 20 or however many there are, I'm sure they're all excellent and they have great things and we're going to read them and have lots of ideas. But if you do nothing else with this book, do tilt one. Really question everything you're doing and why you're doing it and make sure that you're doing it because it works for your kiddo and for your family. And you're going to see such improvement in your life, right? Like just in, yeah.
I think that makes perfect sense. So that's the end of tilt one. We've done our first tilt.
Yay. We have big plans of covering 3 of them today. We'll see. If you've been following along, you know that this might be above and beyond our abilities, but we're going to give it a go.
I think we're doing good. I think we're off to a great start. So tilt 2, get out of isolation and connect.
Yes. Right.
Nice.
So I think she starts on page 94. She starts with this. She says, I'd never worked with a life coach before. And when a professional acquaintance offered to coach me pro bono as part of her certification process, I jumped at the chance. For anyone who's listening, I just want to say if you need to do some free hours of life coaching for your certification or something, I'm here. I'm here for you. I got you, boo. Send me a message.
Can I throw that out there for like a massage therapist who might be looking to get their hours?
Maybe a little harder virtually, but
Oh, you need practice clients? I'm in.
right. Oh, man. Okay, so on the next page, the first kind of subheading is called the cost of isolation. And for me, there was one quote that just kind of stood out right off the top. And she says, intellectually, we know we're not alone. But when we're in the thick of the really hard stuff, not seeing our reality reflected around us, no one genuinely knowing our experience, it sure can feel that way. And I think that's true, right? I'm not going to sit here and say in any way, shape, or form that that isn't true. In this section, she goes on talking about how hard it is to not see yourself reflected back and how easy it is to end up feeling isolated and alone and like you're the only one with the struggle, or the people who are saying like, oh, well, yeah, my kiddo does this and it's really hard. And it's like, well, you don't understand. Our struggles are bigger. Our struggles are worse. And I kind of struggle with this a little because I feel like one of the biggest challenges we have as parents today is that we aren't as accepting of the fact that everyone has struggles and your struggles are not better or worse or more than someone else's because someone only knows what they know. You only know the struggle that you're having. You only know what that feels like. You only know how you're trying to get through it. And I just really feel like we need to do better as parents of accepting and acknowledging that parenting is hard for everyone. And yes, it's not the same. It's not the same by any stretch of the imagination. And we also need to know and acknowledge the privilege that we have in whatever situation we're in. But if we could all just take a step back and extend that, I don't know, I'm not sure if grace is the right word, but, just kind of this like fundamental belief that everyone is struggling and doing the best they can and everyone needs support around that. I just feel like parents would feel a lot less alone in general.
What you just said reminds me of that quote that everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about, so just be kind of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's it. It's like you just never know the complete picture of what someone has going on. You have maybe what they've shown you or what you think you've put together based upon some clues, but you really don't have the full picture. So
Yeah.
So she's got here, there's a bunch of stuff that comes up in this tilt and also the next tilt about other people and how the world perceives us, or how our friends or our family perceive us and our actions and our kids and things like that. And so this was kind of the first quote for me that related to that on a deeper level, which was on 95. It says, when the people in our world, our friends, our parenting peers, our own parents, our extended family, don't understand or relate to what we're dealing with, many of us simply withdraw. We censor ourselves, choosing not to talk about how hard it is, avoid feeling disconnected when others don't get it. And it's true. Sometimes it's easier than fighting, is just to curl up in your shell. And it's easier in that moment. But in the long term, this chapter or this tilt goes on and on about how damaging that isolation is. And so if it's not those people that will understand and offer support, then putting in the effort, which again, we're tired and we're overwhelmed and we're stressed. So it's like, great, now I've got another chore to do. But finding the people who will support you so that when you're in that moment of crisis or you need that confidence boost or whatever it might be, you've got some people in your back pocket who'll do that, where you don't have to go in your turtle shell and do it alone.
Right. Well, and she really gets into that in the next section, right? So on page 96, the next kind of subtitle is the gifts of connection. And she gives a personal anecdote. For me, it was under the next section that's kind of like a subheading under that subsection called Consider Where You Might Be Isolating Yourself. And she has this list of questions. And then, and then she kind of goes on. So I'll start with the questions because I think they're good. If you're listening to us, you should really ask yourself these things. So, am I avoiding certain situations or conversations because of who my child is or concerns about how they might behave? Am I being inauthentic in the way I show up in my daily life? Have I become less engaged in outside interests or more secluded in general as challenges with my differently wired child have increased? Do I feel as though most everyone else doesn't or can't understand what I'm experiencing and what's hard in my world? And then she goes on to say, if you've answered yes to any of these questions, it's important to recognize that this kind of isolation is a choice, and a harmful one at that, since it feeds our insecurities. But, right, so like that's kind of heavy. And if you're like, oh, damn, I said yes to like 3 out of the 4 of those, like apparently I'm real messed up, right? The very next thing is find your people. And on the next
Mhm.
page on 99, I really appreciated this. So she's got a quote. She says, you don't need a whole team. A few good friends or family members who really get it are enough to keep you from withdrawing or spiraling into full-on isolation.
Mhm.
I just thought that was so important because I feel like social media and TV shows and movies, right? They all tell us this story of how we're supposed to have this huge posse of friends, and you're rolling out 12 deep for girls' weekends in Vegas, and you're having, wine club get together, and there's 15 ladies all together. That's not really reality for a lot of people. And that's
Mhm.
okay. Like, being a grown up is understanding that quality over quantity is valuable, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, the visual that I had are these Instagram perfect weddings that you have now where there's like 5,000 bridesmaids and you're like, I had one. I had a bridesmaid. What is it?
Yes. My brother stood up with me, right? Like,
Yeah.
it didn't mean that I didn't have other people that I could have included, but my brothers were the most important. And we didn't meet like, yeah, exactly. Like, we were not 12 deep on each side. You see him? Yeah. How long was that song?
Yeah. Exactly. So she's got here, I think on that same page that you were just on, it says, do you have at least one or two go-to people you can text or call with an SOS when you're in need of mental, emotional, moral, or physical support? And then on the next page, I really liked this. She says, you might even explicitly tell them what you'll need in those moments so they can be as supportive as possible when the time comes. So I've shared on the podcast that we've just made a huge move and just kind of blown up our lives and changed everything. And I will never forget. I was driving on the turnpike one day and I was crying and I called my best friend and she answered the phone and I was already in tears. She could already tell that I was a mess. And I go, I just need you to tell me that this is all going to work. And I'm like, I don't even care if you believe it at this moment in time. I just need you to tell me it's all going to work and that it's all going to be okay. And she did. It's all going to work. It's going to be fine. It's going to be better than mine. It's going to be great. And by the time I got off the phone, I felt better. But so having those people is helpful, and to give somebody kind of the user manual so that in that moment they can best support you and help get you on track. I found that really great advice here.
I totally agree. So the next section is on page 100, and it's one of those like subsections called Plug the Leaks. And she just uses this metaphor about a life raft and how you want to plug even the smallest leaks while they're still small. So you don't end up like trying to deal with it when you're taking on massive amounts of water because you ignored the small leak until it was like a real disaster. I just thought that was a good metaphor. I think a lot of people tend to be like, well, it's not really an emergency, so I'll deal with it later. And we put off the things that are little annoyances. But the reality is most of the time, little annoyances become real big issues and like pain points when you just keep putting them off and refusing to address them. So address them when they're little.
I feel targeted by you bringing that up. Thank you very much. Like, shut up, Amanda. It's a system that's not working well for me, but we're not fixing it. Okay.
Okay. And we're tilting is telling me not to judge. So I'm going to let you go on with your bad self.
We're going to continue to wait until things are a crisis. So,
all right. Okay. If that works for you. Then just on the next page on 101 starts another section that's called Be a Resource for Others. And I think, we're doing that. That's how we kind of ended up doing this podcast in the first place. And that's grown with the Facebook group that we host and other things like that. But it can happen in lots of areas. And I do think there's a lot of value to it. Like I know when we were going through fertility treatments and then kind of right after, I had a lot of different friends who like, oh, I have a friend who is going through this and they don't really understand or they like your experience or that kind of thing. And so just being able to be there and, it's not only is it helpful to be a resource to others, but it creates a deeper, bigger sense of community, I think. And so, when you have the chance, obviously self-care is important and, don't give more than you have to give and all of that kind of jazz. Like I'm not advocating that, but when you have the time and the energy, it's like, don't overlook sharing your personal experience with someone who needs to hear from someone who's already kind of walked that road.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I pulled a really small line here on page 101, and she's talking about a conversation that she had with someone else. So this isn't Deborah Reber saying this, but she does agree with the woman's comment where the person says, it's a grieving process, but you'll get through it. And she's talking about that emotional tidal wave that can sometimes come with a diagnosis. And I think it depends on your understanding of neurodivergence, your acceptance of neurodivergence, your place in life when you get this news. Obviously, it's going to impact different people differently. But it just reminded me of this webinar that I had watched at one point with Dr. Hollowell, he wrote Driven to Distraction. He's one of the leading voices in the ADHD world. And he said he has seen doctors tell parents that their kids are ADHD with the same weight and gravity that they would tell someone that their kid had cancer. And his perspective is this isn't a death sentence. This isn't the end of the world. This is different wiring. It's a different path. But why are we delivering the news in that way? It kind of perpetuates this grieving concept or this grieving process. By the time my kids were diagnosed formally, I had already done so much research into it and had already kind of come to a place where I was like, this isn't the end of the world. It's just different. It's just going to be a very different path, etc. But I thought this concept of it being grieving I'm not going to judge how someone else takes the news because that's your journey, that's your path, that's your evolution. But I felt like it was a sad term to use because
Oh,
it's just that thing of like, your kid's not dying, your kid's not tragic, your kid's not broken. They're different. And so for me, it made me sad. But if you're grieving the vision of what your child's life was going to be, then go for it. I mean, I'm not judging what
yeah.
your process is, but for me, I was like, oh, the choice of word just made me sad.
Well, I feel like I took it a totally different way, right? I feel like in life, you are constantly going through the grieving process, the 5 stages of grief. And that happens every time you do anything, right? Like you sell your house. You're sad about selling your house because you're thinking of all of the things that you did there and all of the memories you had and all of the things you thought were going to happen, or your husband gets laid off and you have to move. And so, for a new job and you go through the grieving process. And it's this process of like remembering where you were and the good times and acknowledging the things that you thought were going to happen in the future. And then letting those things go. Like the grieving process is the process of like, okay, like I thought through it. I had my little pity party, whatever that looks like for whatever reason. And now I'm letting it go. And I just think like if more people would embrace the grieving process on the daily, we would all be so much happier with where we are and what we're doing. And so, yeah, I took it as a totally different, like, yeah, like, this is the new thing. And it's not what you thought it was going to be because no one is like when they're pregnant and reading their what to expect while expecting, they're like, and at 3 or 4 years old, we'll pay an obscene amount of money to go and spend days with this, clinical psychologist or an educational psychologist and have this assessment. And then we'll get a whole list of acronyms. And, like, no one is expecting that. So just, like I wasn't expecting it. This is where we are. Now we're letting it go and we're moving forward with where we are. Uh, Yeah.
I like your example of the process about feeling it, letting it go, moving through it. The
Yeah.
word was where I got stuck, but I like
Yeah.
your process behind it. So,
Yeah. And I think that's it, right? Like for me, I thought when I read it, I immediately thought like the 5 stages of grief and how whenever anything comes up, you have this process to work through that ultimately ends in like acceptance and happily moving forward. Whereas I can see how for you, when you read it, it was like grieving process as grief, not so much like the 5 stages of
mhm.
acceptance kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm.
And so then this tilt once again wraps up with a start now box. And that says, consciously connect with one person, online community, or social media group for the purposes of getting out of isolation and building up your support network. And I mean, I think that's really important. If you aren't part of a community, if you don't have someone, go find it. We're a great place to start. We have a Facebook community, but there are plenty of other places as well. And if you're not feeling quite ready to dive into a community, because we get it, like social media and online groups right now are a little sketch and questionable. Like people are not being kind. Like the internet as a whole has lost its mind. So read all of the books, right? Join the Facebook groups if you feel comfortable. Listen to the podcasts. There's so many out there to listen to, but sometimes you just need to actually talk to someone, right? To get reassurance from someone or even to just ask those questions that are like so super specific to your situation. And we here at Homeschool Moms, we totally do that, right? So we'll put a link in the show notes where you can book a session or you can find the link on our website. But you can book to meet with just me one on one or Meagan one on one. Or if you think your situation is a little bit like me and a little bit like what Megan's got going on, and it would be most valuable to kind of have a group discussion, you could totally book a call with both of us together. All of those options are on that link if that's something you'd like to do. The sessions, they're super rewarding for us, right? It goes back to that be a resource for others. We want to do that. And so far, right, our coaching clients have said the same thing. There's always a first for everything. So hopefully you're not the first, but so far they've been positive for everyone involved, right? And it's just a really great option, right, for getting super customized, personalized feedback as opposed to going on a Facebook group and 100 people are shouting like uninformed guesses and ideas and stuff from their own place. And you don't know how much unpacking they've done and how much acceptance they have and how happy their family life actually is, right? Like, and then you walk away and you're like, oh, I have all of these things to think about. And I didn't even, like 18 of these things hadn't even crossed my mind. Like, yeah, you can come and talk to us. We'll be happy to help.
Yeah, you end up more confused than you started sometimes when you have those posts because it's overwhelming. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those sessions are amazing. We love them. So come hang with us. We would love to help.
Yeah,
We love
absolutely.
it. So tilt number 3, our final tilt of the week. I think we've done it. We're
Yeah, I
I
think
don't
we're
want to
going to
count
make
my
a lot
chickens
of
before they're hatched, but we're doing
it.
good.
It's looking good. Yeah.
Exactly.
You might have to do a little bit of fancy editing or we're going to have to talk fast, but it's looking good.
Yeah. Tilt number 3 is let go of what others think.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think you've got the first quote there, Amanda.
Yeah, so she tells the story. Most of the time she starts these out with like a personal story or anecdote. And so at the very top, she says, "When I asked my son how his self-identity has been shaped by the way others perceive him," and this is in the context of like a novel study that they're doing at home, right? He matter-of-factly replied, quote, "That's not a part of my self-identity at all." And, for her, she's just like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it." To me, I was kind of like, well, I know I'm specifically trying to raise my kiddo to live this level of self-confidence and even knowledge of self, right? Like to be aware and in tune enough with your own body and what's going on, and then to be able to embrace it and just be like, this is who I am. And you can take me or leave me. There are plenty of people who take me, and there are plenty of people who leave me. And I'm fine with that because I'm not trying to convince people to want me if they don't, kind of thing. And I think, I don't know, I just think a lot of other homeschoolers, and I'm sure caregivers in general, but I feel like when you actively choose to homeschool, a lot of the time it's with this goal of really making sure your kids who march to the beat of their own drum continue to do that without feeling peer pressure to conform and fit in and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, we talked about that way back in season 1 too, when we did that episode, Why Are Homeschoolers Called Weird? And it was that thing because they don't bend and try to meld who they are as a human being into the societal standard or the friend group or whatever. And that's so uncommon now that it's viewed as weird, which is an interesting thing. Later on that same page, she says, worrying about what others are thinking about who my child is, what he does, or how he behaves, and consequently what kind of parent I am, has taken up a lot of my time and energy. And when you talk to me in terms of time and energy, I'm all about that because I'm bananas busy, as most of us are. And so when you can point out to me something that is a waste of my very valuable time and energy, I'm like, "Oh, I can let that go. This is great. This is amazing." So I liked that line. I was like, oh, you're speaking my language, Deborah Reber. So I liked that one.
Yeah.
Then on the next page, she's got when we're considering the reaction and thoughts of others on how we parent, we don't advocate as loudly as we could, don't parent from a place of true authenticity, inadvertently tell our children they are not okay, parent with our ego instead of our hearts, and make questionable parenting decisions. And I loved that one because I thought, how many times do we see people who are trying to justify the decisions that they're making with their own children to their parents, their in-laws, their siblings who don't understand why they're homeschooling? And so I thought, again, when you kind of look at the consequence of playing nice and placating other people like that, that there's consequences to yourself and to your children and to your core family. And I loved the way she spelled that out there as a result.
Yeah. No, it's true, right? I mean, when we're so worried about people who aren't in our little core group, it really can negatively impact the ones that it really matters.
Mhm.
I'm like, I almost don't want to share this note because we have discussed how terrible I am with names. But at the bottom of that page, 105, it says, in an article for Psychology Today, behavior expert Dr. Raj Raghunathan, that's really wrong, and I'm sorry, but he writes that most people overestimate how much and how badly others think about them. And I just thought, like, how many people need to be reminded of that, right? Like, really, I don't think about the vast majority of people nearly as much as they probably think that I'm thinking about them. I have a lot of stuff on my plate and like my own little family and my own projects and my own things. Like I I can almost guarantee you I'm not thinking about you, whoever the you is, as much as you think I'm thinking about you, right? And I'm not thinking as badly about you because I just don't have the energy for it. Like I got other things to spend my energy on.
There's a Schitt's Creek example of that when David goes to get his driver's license and he's like spiraling over it. And Alexis is like, no one cares. He's like, of course people care. And she goes, no, no one is thinking about you the way you think they are. And then, of course, she's proven right. And it's a whole scene and life lessons are learned and it's brilliant. So, yeah, but that's what I took from that when I read it. I was like, oh, it's like David when he went to get his driver's license. Yeah. There's a bit here on 106 that is in a section called Why Letting Go is Hard. So she's talking about when we care too much about what other people think, and sometimes we don't then support our child as our number one priority because of that concern of saving face with other people. So she has things here like times that she has conspiratorially rolled her eyes about Asher's behavior because that's what they were looking for. So basically she sided with other people like, oh, can you believe my kid is doing that? Went into too much detail about parenting challenges to ensure another parent understood. And that's what you were saying before, Amanda, right? This like, but you don't understand how difficult it is for me. And so she's got that there. Reprimanded her kid in public because she knew that's what others would expect, even though she knew it was not at all helpful for him in that moment and things like that. And it's like, oh, this is one of those hard realities where you're thinking like, oh yeah, okay. And then when you read those examples and they hurt to read because you're thinking like, oh, the damage that I've done, whether my kid knows it or not, you still feel terrible at the thought of having potentially done some of those things for the sake of appearances.
Though I felt for me in this section, I was also a little like, okay, I get it. And we do need to be our child's number one advocate because they're the child and we're the grown up. But we are also people. And it's okay to not always be your child's number one advocate first. You get to also be yourself first. You get to prioritize yourself sometimes. And obviously, you don't want to be an ass about these things, right? But also don't completely beat yourself up over the fact that like there was a moment where you were like, oh my God, are we doing this again? And you commiserated with the other people in the room who were like, again, this is happening again. Like that, you're a person and you get to have those feelings. Like, hopefully you locked them down pretty quickly and then dealt with it appropriately, but you're allowed to be like, again? Really? I don't know.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're on to the next one. The section is called The Freedom to Be. And she says, when someone I've just met asks me where Asher goes to school, I'm hyper aware of how my reply, I'm actually homeschooling him, is received. And I was just like, oh man, I feel this. Not necessarily in the ways that she outlines it in the book, but I really dread that question because you know that as soon as you answer the question, people feel like it's an invitation to tell you their opinion and to try to convince you that you're doing something wrong. And I'm not open to that discussion. Like, I'm not discussing this with you. It was not your call. It was, you don't have all of the facts and details. And I'm not going to give you all of the facts and details because you have no business knowing all of them. Like, I'm parenting, you parented your kids or chose not to have kids or whatever the case may be. This is my family. We're doing what's right in my family. Just that thing. I feel like as soon as you answer the question, people take it as like an open invitation to like go all in on you. So yeah, I hate that question. even though I feel really good about it. I have no doubts about, I have no regrets. But I still am like, I don't want
But is
hot
that time and
together.
energy? Yeah, that's it. Time and energy thing. Like, do I really have to? I mean, sometimes people are like, oh, does the school board send you textbooks to work from? Did you have to get a license for that? I mean, we're starting so freaking far behind the start line with questions like that I'm like, I cannot explain this to you. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. Get with 700 person to do this. Like, I can't. It's just, yeah. Okay. So she talks about here again, this kind of vision of perfect parenting or ideal parenting or goal parenting, which is to stand in our truth, to show up authentically every day and parent with confidence and conviction. We want to be the same parent during a public meltdown at Cold Stone Creamery as we are in the privacy of our own home. And you know that some real shit went down at the Cold Stone Creamery for her to have used that example. Right? I don't want to know what happened at Cold Stone now. But yeah, it makes sense, right? Like to be the same person in private that you are in public and kind of be that self-assured and that confident. And is it going to happen every day? No. Are you going to be perfect? No, because you're a human being, but to have that there, which is pretty cool. Then she's got another one on page 108 where she kind of has this moment of self-reflection thinking, wait, am I giving this person or their comment or their judgment a lot of time and energy that could be better spent just taking care of myself and taking care of my child? And she encourages the question here, what kinds of judgments or comments or books are a trigger for you? And I love that because part of what we'll talk about in a few minutes at the end of this tilt is having a plan and being prepared. And so if you can already think about what those questions are so that you can pre-plan and get your grounding a little bit so that they don't catch you off guard as much, I feel like that's helpful. So I liked that advice there.
Yeah. No, I had that same one tagged and then I saw you already had it, so I didn't bother typing it out. So on the next page, she has another one of these pull-out boxes with some questions. It's called the reflect box. And I just thought these questions were good that just take a step back and think about it. So how concerned am I about what others think about my parenting style or choices? How do I suffer when I prioritize others' thoughts and opinions over what I feel, think, or know to be true? And how is my child affected when I prioritize others' thoughts and opinions over what I think, feel, or know to be true? And so for me, it was just kind of one of those, if you have the book and you're like, I just don't have time to read. I do not have the time for this. The reflect box and the start now box are kind of the really high level things that you could just go and look at those. Or even if after the fact, you're like, oh, what was that thing that I wanted to do? Like you could just browse those kind of pull out boxes that she's got there. I think helpful. And then the next section is called Make Sure Your Ego Isn't Running the Show. And in this one, this is where she talks about like that having a canned response. I am all about a canned response in so many ways and areas and places of my life. When I took over as the HOA board president, that was one of the first things we did. Like, let's write up a whole bunch of canned responses for all of the things that people complain about. And then from here on out, you just copy and paste that when they send you the email complaining about that thing, because we're not having a discussion. Here is the response. It's short, it's succinct. Hopefully it shuts down any further conversation. You've got the information you need. We're done. I'm all about an answer that makes it clear, like, here's your answer. We're done. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the vibe that I pulled from this quote on page 109 in that section, where she's basically talking about a conversation that she had with somebody who didn't believe her about stuff that was going on with Asher. And instead of just ignoring the woman, she doubled down on like proving that what she was saying was the case was actually the case and this and that. And in the moment that could really happen, right? Where you're like,
these are, yeah, it's important to be like, yeah, no, like wait, these are all the reasons and like justifying and
like you're not understanding.
no.
And in the end, she's like, I wish I had just ignored this person. And so for me, this goes back to the same one about parents and in-laws and whatever else who are questioning your decisions. I cannot say this enough. You owe no one an explanation about what you do with your child. It's your core family are the only people that have a say in this. And I get it. People are like, I know about my parents, they ask me questions all the time. You don't have to. And I feel like that's like one of those, you give them an inch, they take a mile situations. Shut it down. shut it down, right? Because you owe no one an explanation in these scenarios. And that can be hard to remember in the moment when you get all fired up, but shut it down.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that section, she kind of wraps it up with this quote. She says, the key is to call ourselves out on it, give ourselves a pass. Beating oneself up doesn't really help, and commit to doing better next time. And as we all know, there will always be a next time. Right. And I just, again, right. I've already kind of mentioned it. I don't want to harp on it, but that thing of like, we're all going to make mistakes. And you can be the kind of person that sits there and is like, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake. I did it again. I said I wasn't going to do it. And I did it again. And I did that. And I just don't know. And what does that do? Like, what does that help? What does that accomplish? Like, nothing, like acknowledge it, make a plan to do better next time. And even if it's only incrementally better next time, incremental improvement is still improvement. It is still progress. And eventually you'll get where you're trying to get to. And then maybe you'll set a new goal for yourself. It's okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so the next one is called Train Your Friends. I have to say, I felt like it was a little bit of a misleading title because actually to me, it just stresses the importance of communicating and effective communication with people you care about. So if someone you really care about says something that isn't helpful or is even, like actually hurtful, even though they didn't mean it to be, just like take a step back and then calmly tell them how it made you feel, why it made you feel that way, and share what they could say that would land better with you or what kind of discussion. It's a super basic idea around interpersonal communication and effective interpersonal communication. It's not always easy, but it's also not complicated.
And then really the last two things that I noted were just that concept of plan ahead, make a list of situations that historically have been challenging for your child and will likely come up again, and plan how you will respond to them. Because when we have a plan, we feel confident and it's a win. And so I loved that. Okay, that went really poorly. How can I prevent that from happening again? I would not like to relive that. And so making that plan and putting that into place, which is great.
Yeah, definitely. Also all about a plan. Like
Yeah.
I may not have the same kind of anxiety that you do, but I also always joke that I have like a plan A through, G. And then all of my plans A through G also have like 3 contingency
So
plans for
fun.
each of them. Yeah. So whatever happens will be fine. And it's like I can roll with anything, but only because I have made all of the plans and I've thought of how we would shift for all of those plans. And when something happens there, like how that's going to shift. And so then I'm like, okay, so I thought through all of it. So now I can't possibly be surprised. So like, let's just go give it a try.
Well, so like really quick sidebar, but that's like an activity that I did once in therapy was, because we've talked about the fact that I go to like red terror level alert very quickly as far as like the worst possible thing that could ever happen that will likely never happen, but my brain goes there. And this therapist was like, what are you getting out of that? Like, if you continue to do it, you have to be getting something out of it. There's a payoff there for you, even if it's not a healthy one. And I was like, okay. So I thought about it and I was like, that was my payoff was I can't be surprised. So nothing can ever catch me off guard if I've already thought of the absolute worst possible scenario. So you're kind of doing the same thing, but in a less panicked way, it sounds like. So I'm sorry. I know that's okay. There's pills for that. It's okay. Yes. Well, that wraps us up for this week. We did get 3 whole tilts. We rocked it. Thank you so much for joining us. We've been moving slowly through this book, but that's just because there's so much awesome meat to it. And so many of our listeners are raising differently wired kids. So it really makes sense to dig in, take the time, and really have these conversations. So next week, we'll be discussing more tilts. Can't promise you how many. We'll see how it goes. And in the meantime, pop over to our Facebook group, also named Homeschool Moms Unfiltered, Secular and Progressive AF, to continue the conversation. At the end of the week, we talk a little bit more about book club and ask some questions and hash it out a little bit more amongst the crowd. So we'd love to see you there. But in the meantime, happy homeschooling.
Yeah. Have a great one.